maybe one day those trans youth won't have to go down to the Capitol and they can just go have fun with their friends.
Welcome to Talking About Kids. I am your host, R. Bradley Snyder, researcher, activist, and author of The 5 Simple Truths of Raising Kids. During Pride Month, Talking About Kids is devoted to LGBTQ issues. This third installment is about the rights of LGBTQ youth. My guest is Gaelle Esposito, a partner with the lobbying, government relations, communications, and legislative advocacy firm Creosote Partners. Gaelle and I discussed the current state of the rights of LGBTQ youth and what you can do to help ensure their access to health and mental health care and education. This episode is sponsored in part by the Arizona Department of Health Services Must Stop Bullying campaign through its Title V Maternal and Child Health Program. For more information, go to muststopbullying.org. And now, the interview.
I grew up in Arizona, and I actually got involved at a very young age in local politics. I got involved while I was in high school. I always joke I was a very popular kid, as you can imagine. Um, the first issues that really got me engaged, though, were public education and immigration. This was the mid 2000s.
Mm.
We saw the first major protests in favor of comprehensive immigration reform. And also locally here in Arizona, we were starting to see the first signs of a systemic issue with resourcing our public schools, with supporting our public school teachers and the students and communities within. And in this period, right, like it was also a very explosive, I guess, period in LGBT rights as well. This was the heart of the fight over gay marriage and the rights of same sex couples. And Arizona was a big battleground around this. Not just in like 2004 with the presidential election and everything there, but in 2006 and then after high school when I was in college in 2008, the statewide ballot initiatives there. And these were also issues that I started to engage in along with the political campaigns at the time, and all that like experience sort of culminated in me working on the signature collection effort to recall our then state Senate President Russell Pierce, who was known as the sponsor of SB 1070. From there, I got out of Dodge for a little bit. Lived in Massachusetts for a year. The only other state I've lived in. Had a very different experience there, as you might imagine,
A
and then
little bit
came back
different, right?
and did public education advocacy before doing the work that I do now in progressive lobbying and advocacy work for a whole host of clients. And all of those fights, and this really was all building up to the real answer to your question. All of those
Hmm.
fights really were focused around helping the people who did not really have a voice within the halls of power here in Arizona to find ways to access those and access their own power. And that was really the premise that started our current, lobbying and advocacy firm, Creosote Partners, where we're all values based. We only do it for the causes we believe in. So we're not the normal lobbyists you see. And the joke I always tell there is, I only sold half my soul. I'm still a lobbyist, so it's not all good. But like we're trying to do it for the right causes. And LGBT rights have always been a part of that. Even before I came out myself 2 years ago.
It's really interesting, and obviously, talking about kids is about kids. It's in the title. But the rights of LGBTQ youth have been continue to be, I think, on the kind of front line of the debate around all these human right issues. And we're having these discussions about what sort of care they're allowed to have. We're having other debates too about what sort of education they're allowed to receive. And why I was excited to talk to you is, I think in all of that, I don't even sometimes fully understand what are the rights of youth in the United States. And I know that they're not laid out, and maybe we'll get to that. They're not laid out in a comprehensive federal way where we can say across the United States we share all the youth share all these same rights. But can you kind of give us a primer on what you know about the rights, in particular, of LGBTQ youth?
Yeah, and I think to the start of your question there, we are seeing a coordinated and concerted effort to scapegoat LGBT people, and
Yeah,
particularly LGBT youth, at the altar of political advantage. It is a long term and sophisticated effort by
right.
folks on the far right. Particularly those at the Alliance Defending Freedom and other associated groups. And I think they have really centered on this question you were asking because they found fertile ground uh, to undermine the concept of children having rights at all,
Right.
really, and have really encouraged a view of children as nothing more than extensions of personal property of the parent.
Yeah.
And I think it's a rather, you know, unsophisticated compared to the sophisticated way they've approached the scapegoating, but a rather like unsophisticated and blunt way to handle that conversation, which I think is purposeful, right? It's
Hmm.
an easy tool for them. Um, and especially because unlike, other countries, other places, even individual states, like the rights of those children, have never been fully enumerated in any real way. And I think it's really important that we start to shift that conversation and talk about what the rights that those children do have and how do we uh, combine that with our understanding of parental rights, which is still important, uh, but not the blunt tool for oppression and abuse that the far right want to make it into.
Well, in some ways, we're seeing the worst of both worlds in how we're approaching some of these issues right now. At least from my perspective, because not only is it the case that we say to this youth, you don't have any sort of say in what sort of medical treatment you can access, and we'll start there. But and we say that that's a decision that your parents get to make, unless they make a decision we don't like, because they don't get to do that either. So it's kind of this weird tiered oppression where first the oppression comes from the state saying, well, you have this range of healthcare options and mental health options available to you. And then inside that narrowed range is your parents get to decide. Am I thinking about that incorrectly, or is it really that bleak?
No, I think you are thinking about it correctly in how the far right approaches this, and particularly, this intersects obviously with all the other conversations that
Right.
we are having about bodily autonomy in this country right now,
Yeah.
and it is a broader push by these extreme voices who seek to impose control on anybody that is different from the one that they imagine to be the right and moral way of living. And that views, both uh, uh, children and more broadly, the reproductive capacities of any individual as their purview to uh, oversee and determine. And I think it all flows from that, right? Like their goal is never truly parental rights, as you pointed out, because
Right.
they will still preempt and undermine the rights of parents who do something that they don't want. Their end goal is control
Right.
over the bodies and livelihoods of uh, people who they think are living outside of their far right value structure.
And I'm much more comfortable talking about the science of some of this, and then and so just getting back to the science for a moment. So, if I am a 15-year-old and I'm a 15-year-old that is identifying with the gender assigned to me at birth, but I'm an adolescent. And what we know from all of the science about adolescent and development and sexual identity development is that adolescence is a time when everyone experiences swings in attraction and feeling and identity and orientation and expression. It's just modal. That's what humans go through during adolescence. It's kind of one of the defining things. But these are feelings that are new to every adolescent that goes through it the first time they have it. And I'm a 15-year-old in Arizona, and I want someone to talk to about this. I want someone who isn't in my peer group because, and these are, I don't know how they feel. I'm an adolescent. I have to push all of my communication through this really unfortunate set of what do they think about me? How am I projecting myself? What are they going, how are they going to, right? What professional help is available just to that youth?
Yeah, and I think also before I answer that part,
Yeah,
this goes back to what we were just talking about before,
right,
because they want that youth who is looking for somebody to talk to be restricted in who they can talk to, right? They want to
right.
prevent them from being able to talk to a trusted adult at school in a private manner. They want to prevent them from being able to talk to a trusted medical provider
Mm,
in a private manner. Um, but they only want to prevent that so that once again it all funnels back to perhaps the adult who is not going to be supportive of them because they restrict the options to the adults who are. And all of this is to force a funnel for those young people, force those young people into a funnel to always end up at a point where they are prevented
mm.
from being trusted and supported and loved for who they are. And so there are still options that are, available
Okay.
out there and providers and people who are doing this good work, whether they're medical providers or, mental health professionals, and even, trusted adults within schools where those laws and policies are, allowed to support them. And Arizona has, some restrictions in that space already. Uh, but I think, it is always important to understand, like, while those people exist, we do, continue to have this structural challenge coming from the far right
Hmm.
to further narrow who they can go to.
There's a couple things that I don't like about that. One is that
There's a lot I don't
there's,
like about
yeah,
it.
there,
Weird.
all right, there's a lot. I'll start with two that come to mind. Many come to mind. But there's a quote by the lyricist Tim Rice that I like to go back to, and he talks about in when he first started making music, if somebody handed you a record and said, "Hey, you should check this out," Tim Rice said, "Well, at least you knew that two people liked that." The person that like wrote the songs and the person that made the record, because they were always necessarily two people. It was vetted somehow. if we have teens looking for answers to these questions and there aren't experts and professionals available to them, they go online
Mhm.
and they go to TikTok and they go to YouTube. And I have nothing against them as platforms, but I respect experts. And sometimes the advice that is most prominent isn't informed by science on on any of the platforms. And so that's my concern, is that we're not letting youth that have real natural modal questions access experts.
And I think you've also touched on the central flaw of their approach and
Mm,
why they will inevitably fail is they will never be able to fully control the information that an individual has access to in this country, at least not for the foreseeable future. Um, these young people, or adults even who are looking to find these resources will be able to find it. And to your point, right, it's just going to be a matter of like if there is a trusted and real expert that they're going to be able to access there. And luckily, we still have a lot of great organizations and individuals, and as we've talked about, medical providers too, that are willing to do that work and be helpful here in Arizona, right? And there are uh, also supportive groups for the parents, right? You have groups like AZ Typo. We talked about Glisten for students. They're in Southern Arizona, the Southern Arizona Gender Alliance, which is merging with another organization down there. There's lots of options and community groups that are doing the work, that will be doing the work, so long as they are able. And the medical providers and people that they trust, and that people will be able to uh, connect young folks with.
mhm.
And I think this is something that will be very hard for them to get rid of. And I think it's incumbent upon us as a community to make sure that those sorts of resources are the most accessible for those young
Mm.
people, because it is full of people who are trusted, who can connect with experts, who do know how to help people to be loving and supportive, and trusting of people knowing their own bodies, and that's a really important thing.
And last year at this time, I had an ongoing discussion with one of the listeners. I'm not actually sure he was a listener. I think he just was reacting to a title of one of the episodes in the beginning. But he was very patient with me in explaining his views, and we had a decent dialogue. And one of the things that he said is that he was worried about people on the left forcing youth into identities before they were biologically able to know what their orientation, identity, and expression is. And I said back to them, by the way, I'm against that too. Like, I don't think you should force anybody into any identity that is not true and genuine and authentic. But it seems to me that when we don't prescribe rights to youth, the lack of rights can be abused by people on the left and people on the right.
Yeah, I think it's also a once again, another piece of the puzzle that
Right.
shows a flaw in their approach, right? You try to control these things, and you will never truly be able to control it. Trans people have always existed; they will always exist. Gay and lesbian,
Right.
bisexual, pansexual, we've all been around forever. And regardless of society's oppression. And I think there is a bit of projection that goes on there, right? That they want to control, and therefore they believe that that is what supportive folks are doing, and instead of just, you know, being a passive and loving force that, like, encourages that, like, self-understanding, whatever that ends up looking like. And there really is a broader issue here where they the folks on the right are driven by a sense of discomfort.
Mm,
They're making policy from they are making value judgments from a place of not just fear, but in lack of understanding, but like something makes them feel icky, and that is the justification at the core of it behind so many of these
yeah.
policies. And that fear there of like, well, somebody's going to try and impose something on a young person who isn't ready to make a decision is both that projection and a sense of like discomfort to like the idea
Mhm.
of what they view that child becoming. And they can't like look internally, uh, to start with. You know, they can get there, and I've had lots of conversations with people who have come a long way of being introspective about why they feel that discomfort, and what it means, and how to interact with that, in a constructive and healthy way that helps them, you know, to love their child or
Mm.
their family member who ends up, you know, living their truth.
I think implicit in your answer there, or explicit in your answer, is also this notion of othering. In my experience, when you said that you're trying to control or impose, that's the language of people who are used to an environment where those techniques are used in relationships. And if you are in an environment where there is a lot of coercion and othering happening, you expect that that's what's going to happen. And more importantly, you think if I don't act first, or if I don't maintain power, it'll happen to me, right? That's what's so, precarious about othering. It can be pointed at anyone for any reason if we live in environments where that's allowed to happen.
Yeah.
So I
And
see that happening too.
yeah, I think you are very right there that once again it comes from a fear that they like then displace and point at, you know, a small group of people
Right,
that they are afraid of and traditionally have been
right,
successful in scapegoating and othering, right? Even within my lifetime, the only I'll often say, you know, I came out later in life. I came out in my early 30s, uh, and a big part of that is that, you know, trans representation was not a thing for
yeah,
the vast majority of my life. Up until I was an adult, I think the only trans person I ever really saw in media was the villain in Ace Ventura: Pet Detective, which is not positive. It is
right,
a very negative depiction of trans people. And that sort of thing, that, you know, that shaming, that othering, that, you know, utilization of LGBTQ folks, you know, the queer community at large as the butt of the joke, something to be
mm,
derided, uh, is how so many of these folks lived most of their life. And that no longer being acceptable, that othering no longer being the baseline, uh, creates a fear within themselves that
yeah,
like they are the ones who will be facing the othering soon, and a desire to return to where we were even just 20 years ago, right? Like people so often forget that, um, queer sex was illegal in many states in the 2000s,
yeah.
right? These are like we have come a long way, and this reactionary force. is a byproduct of that progress too, because it creates a loss of a sense of a loss of power because they can no longer other.
And I want to go back to the rights of children and young people, because this other place where I see all youth and LGBTQ youth in particular being so compromised is on, access to books. So, I told you that I would probably end up talking about the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. And one of the things that it lays out, and by the way, listeners know that this comes up time and again. I'm upset that we're the only, country that hasn't ratified it. And the one of the rights that it extends is the right to an education. And right now, we are seeing libraries being, we're seeing them being emptied of any representation of humans that doesn't fit a very, very narrow definition. Now, it's Pride Month, and so we're talking about representation of, of all orientations, of all expressions, of all identities. But we know that they're also taking out of libraries representation of the Black experience, of the Hispanic experience, you name it. If it's not this very narrow experience that actually never really existed, it's being taken out of libraries. What's being done in the advocacy world, in your world, to protect youth's rights and the rights of LGBTQ youth in particular to books where they can read about themselves and read about other people and what they've overcome and gain insight and strengths and inspiration from them?
Yeah, I'm so glad that you brought up the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, and I have a colleague who also talks about this quite often, and shares your frustration. And I think it's the right frustration to have, and it's so important to bring up because it is directly and deeply connected with every other piece of what we have talked about
Yeah.
today, and deeply ingrained with that sense of control. And it goes beyond even just the like explicit LGBT rights focus, into broader conversations about CRT and
Mm-hmm.
these book bans. And I think this also, goes back to the 90s and aughts, with, you know, uh, those far right alliance defending freedom types who uh, really started this movement, and created a drive to undermine the rights of children overall, and establish that sort of control over who they can be and are. And while they'll never be successful with that in the long run, it does end up applying to the policy movement that we're seeing here today. And we have seen these attempts at like restricting access to books here in Arizona more frequently, I think, than pretty much any other bill that targets
Yeah.
you know LGBT folks, or any really broadly any uh, smaller community. And I think once again, they've had varying degrees of success of getting those policies pushed, and have thus far been very unsuccessful within the courts about the legislation that they end up passing there. But what they are successful at is creating a culture of fear that
Yeah.
ends up creating a sense of self censorship within our libraries and our schools. Where folks want to avoid the conflict, right? And avoid the discomfort that they might feel of having to push back. And so we do end up seeing that, right? And we see it in the private sector too, when they like start to do these sorts of pushes, whether or not they can be successful on the policy front. They can be successful, on that front. um and I think we have continued to, on our end, you know use the carrot of, like, hey, you have a community of folks who are going to protect you, right? Like, we have your back, making sure that people understand and feel the support and know their own rights, and where they are protected. And when these bills get pushed, right, like that, there are people who are fighting back and will fight back. And for the places that might try to embrace that kind of censorship, ensuring that the speech rights of folks are protected there, right? Like that, and an understanding that a government institute, whether a library or school, uh, can't do those kinds of content-based restrictions, right? It's very
Right.
explicit, like a lot of case law there. And so I think that two-sided approach of ensuring that folks know that we will be there to protect those rights, and then being out there in the field and in advocacy and in the legal process to defend those rights, helps to push back on that.
One of the things that I find so insidious about the creating conflicts around libraries is that I suspect you and I both know many young people for whom the library was the safe space where between classes, at recess, at different times, this was a place that they could go when they weren't feeling safe around other peers. And then to make that space, to make that a space of controversy, just seems like just particularly gross.
Mhm. Yeah, I think it was very true for me, right?
Mm,
Libraries and bookstores were always those places of comfort, uh, that I, experience, and even to this day, right? That
yeah.
I love to, if I hadn't gone down this path in the policy world, I, often talk about how I would have loved to have been a librarian to create a supportive place, and be helpful to any individual who is searching for uh, ways to better understand themselves. Even helping people find jobs and doing that. There's
Yeah.
so many of those beautiful resources that help. With that broader quest of self fulfillment. And it's not just about this. And so, yeah, it is very insidious. And once again, right, this goes back, right, especially um, as it intersects with that broader far right approach to undermining the rights of children. Where you saw this, I think it started in like the mid '90s, with uh, the like Manhattan Institute and the Alliance Defending Freedom. There was, I think it was Jeffrey Bell and Michael Ferris are the names of, like, the folks who really started that movement. And I'm not sure if you've talked about them on your podcast before. Sorry, I didn't. I
No.
haven't gone through all those, but like they were the ones who were really behind this effort to stop that UN Convention on the Rights of the Child from
Yeah.
being adopted here. And it intersected so much in all of their activities, intersected with undermining these sorts of public institutions, these sorts of connections, right? Like they really fought against things like free condom distribution at libraries and schools or elsewhere, as like these central like pieces of trying to uh, those smaller campaigns to try and undermine that broader fight, and it's ballooned into what we see today, to attack the very core of these public institutions, and undermine the rights of LGBT youth,
Right.
and really anybody that doesn't fit their far right cultural frame.
Well, I want to try to end this on an up note. You mentioned good news earlier. You did. I like you think that it is always useful to look at where we've come. I do believe, and not to stop where we are, but I think it provides some perspective, and it also sort of gives us a trajectory. So we're not starting from nothing. We're building on a movement. But what advice do you have for parents and, well, more importantly, maybe for those teachers, those direct service providers that want to protect the rights of the LGBTQ youth in their classrooms and in their programs? What can they be doing?
I I think continue to build that community, right?
Mm,
Continue to stand up and find, the folks who will have your back and will help you to have the backs of others who, um, just want to be there and be supportive, of, uh, you know, their loved one or, their student or, their family member, or their, whoever it is, you know, even if it's the student and child of somebody they know, right? Like creating that sense of community, I think is going to continue to be important, and to give voice, to uh, those people who are impacted. And I think one of the most important parts of my work is to help provide those trans youth who were directly impacted by these bills with access to the legislators who are considering these bills, right? And that kind of storytelling, um, has been much more impactful than anything I could do as a lobbyist, right? It was central to stopping, some of like a very terrible anti-trans ballot referral that was like an
right.
omnibus of all the different, collection of all the different, anti-trans youth bills that we have seen over the years. And it was because trans youth went and spoke with a legislator who like truly saw them for the first time, and like it's very rare in this experience, as
Mm,
a lobbyist and advocate, where you can see the moment like
mm,
where it clicks for somebody, and where they understand that new perspective. And I was, lucky enough to be there to witness that when, these young people were empowered to speak up for themselves. They did the same, went into hostile territory to talk with one of the sponsors, big sponsor, the first person who ever sponsored a bathroom ban in the country. They went into his office, and uh, their um, their willingness to do that, to be themselves,
yeah.
in the face of that hostility, is powerful, and it is, something that, uh, I think gives, you know, courage, to others who, may not have been ready to come out, yet themselves, and live their truth, to know that like that better world is possible for them. Um, and now these young people shouldn't have to do this. It
Right.
infuriates me every day that they have
Yeah.
to, go down there and defend their humanity, in that way. Um, but that is going to continue to be the thing that, uh, builds power and changes hearts and minds, is like infrastructure, community, and like storytelling of how, these things impact us.
And you still believe it's possible. You still believe that these institutions are going to bend and change.
I do, because they have.
Mm,
And we know it's possible, and it will be hard, and it will not be linear
Hmm.
as we are experiencing right
Hmm.
now. Um, but if we are dedicated, if we are focused, not just on the short term,
Hmm.
the individual fight, but in building a long-term base of power, and support for one another, um, we will have the infrastructure to be able to push these institutions to change. And I think using those short-term fights to create that longer-term infrastructure, to build those organizations, and to build the network of support is critical. But also, yeah, we do have to have our eye
Okay.
towards an understanding that, that uh, our progress is new and hard won, and we will have to continue to build for the future. And even if uh, some of the older folks like me may not, get to see it fully come to fruition,
Right.
building that for that, next generation of young people uh, is so important. And maybe one day uh, those trans youth won't have to go down to the
Right.
Capitol and they can just go have fun with their friends and,
Right.
do summer camp and band and have whatever experiences a like young person should be having, instead of dealing with the legislature. And uh, I hope I get to see that one day.
Well, Gaelle, I want to thank you so much for keeping that belief in our institutions and processes alive. I think that a lot of these youth would be justified. It's in the science, it's well documented that people who have been hurt in their public schools, hurt in their communities, sometimes turn their back on these processes. They say that, I'm not going to get a bill passed. I'm not going to legally get right. So I'm just going to drop out of that participation. So thank you so much for keeping that belief alive. And thank you so much for being a guest on Talking About Kids. This has been a
Yeah.
real pleasure.
I'm happy to be here, and I guess I'll just finish with, it doesn't even have to be faith in those institutions. I don't know if it is the faith in the institution that drives it, but it is the faith in our community to be able to pressure and build those institutions into something that will support us, right? We can drive that, whether or not the institutions are there now. We can make them if we are there for one another and if we are lifting up our stories and building power. And thank you for letting me be here to talk about it and for what you do.
That was Gaelle Esposito. For more information about Gaelle, please visit talkingaboutkids.com. From there, you also can find out about upcoming episodes, suggest a topic, learn more about me and my books, or submit your questions for future guests. Our theme song is by The Senators. For more of their music, go to thesenatorsmusic.com. And remember, kids are young goats and the young humans. And the difference is that young goats are easier to manage.